Thanks for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist. Join me as I seek out the small incremental changes being applied in other industries that we can learn from and that can be applied in healthcare. Can these changes bring immediate value, but also add up to the big improvements and revolution we need in healthcare? Come along with me to explore the possibilities. My innovative guests from around the globe have used small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot.
And today I'm delighted to be joined by Jake Reder. He is the CEO of CeldarMedical. Jake, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Nick. Thanks for inviting me.
So if you would, share a little bit of your background and how you got to this point of Celdar and a little bit about the organization.
Absolutely. So my entire life, I wanted to be a chemist. And as my friends around me were sort of wrestling with what they wanted to do with their lives, I never had any question. I went through undergraduate and then graduate school for chemistry, and eventually came to the conclusion that while I love science, the best scientists have a good idea and then spend the next 10 years trying to disprove it. And that requires an incredible amount of patience. And so I didn't have that and realized it about halfway through graduate school. And began working at a venture capital firm investing in technology-based companies. And this was very exciting because on a given day, you would see 8 to 10 of the futuristic sort of technologies that were coming out of the best labs and the best minds in the world. As a new person in a venture firm, you sit on a pipeline, and so you see everything that comes in, you do a lot of screening, you learn to build that judgment. After a few years there, it was recommended that in order to actually get some operational experience so that I could be most useful either in my own company or to portfolio companies in the future, I should go to a operating entity. And so I did that and worked at a Fortune 500 company doing strategic alliances, both with universities as well as with small companies, as well as internal startups. And so I still got to sort of keep my hands in the startup game there. At that point, I came up to the medical school at Dartmouth College here in New Hampshire, about 2 hours from Boston, and started a new ventures office. And the idea of that office was to identify innovation within the university that had the most potential for positive impact on human health, and then to help it to get out of the university and into the world where it could actually do some good. Within 2 weeks of starting that office, it became really clear that while universities are wonderful for scholarship, they're wonderful for research and teaching, it's not a place to grow companies. And so within 2 weeks, the concept for CeldarMedical came to me and my co-founder, Michael Fanger. And within a few months, we launched the company. And we launched in September of 2008. 2 weeks later, Lehman Brothers went under and the Great Recession began. But we were so small at the time that it didn't bother us at all. And in fact, I would assert that starting a new company in the midst of a recession is maybe not a horrible idea. And so for the last 12 years, I've been running CeldarMedical. The company is a riff on an incubator or accelerator model. And what I mean by that is that we find things inside primarily the academy. We do a lot of diligence. We're still sitting on that pipeline, looking for the very best innovations and discoveries from the best minds that will have the most impact on human health in the future. And then we work really closely together with them to bring that from a eureka moment in an academic lab through to something that can actually be helpful to patients.
Fantastic. So as part of that, it seems clear that the sort of key assets here are that you're developing that experience and broadening the experience within that. So not just the background in science to give you the understanding, but importantly, the business aspect and, seeing lots of it. It reminds me a lot of the 1,000 or the 10,000, I think it is, of, repetitive.
Yes.
And you probably saw that in, the period of time of venture capitalists. So you probably saw almost everything
Absolutely.
of the variations of a theme. So fantastic sort of background, but fast forward to today and solid experience. I couldn't agree with you more. I know that's challenging for many people, but the idea of starting a business in, difficult time is the best time, because if you can survive that. But here we are with pandemic. We've got a terrible sort of response. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts around that, especially given that you've got experience prior to, albeit different, but I'm sure it was impactful at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll take you back a few years, 6 years to be precise. We were sitting around the table in our offices and discussing a really fascinating innovation that came through our pipeline. And the arguments for and against were flying back and forth. And one of the arguments that always came up and still always comes up for infectious disease therapeutics is that there's no commercial market. And there are a lot of reasons for that, which I'm happy to explore. Mm-hmm. But the reality of it is that especially for sporadic diseases, when you don't know when there's going to be an outbreak, there is literally no market until there's an outbreak. And so that's not a market, right? That is not, by Adam Smith's definition, a market. That is an event. And so we had, to that time in our history, always said, we just don't know how to solve this commercial issue. This is bigger than us. It's bigger than our industry even. And so at that meeting, though, there was such a good debate and such a good focus on what the unmet needs were. And those needs, certainly the pandemic is front of mind now. I think at the time we were focused even more so on antimicrobial resistance and the really scary increase in resistance rates across all of our antibiotics. And we said, you know what, there's a medical need here. The company has done well financially. We're stable. We can address this need independent of the lack of a commercial market. And so we started working in infectious disease, and the more we looked, the more interesting things we saw. And fairly early on, we came across a broad spectrum antiviral that I, to this day, am still very excited about. We looked for funding, we looked for partners, and it was always close, but not quite. You know, infectious disease is a hard area, and we kept working on it and kept working on it. That antiviral is effective against SARS-CoV-1, the SARS that was the outbreak in 2003. It's also effective against MERS. It's also effective against filoviruses. And now that we're seeing it's also binding SARS-CoV-2. And having that realization in January of 2020 was incredibly impactful. There was obviously the human toll that we were seeing coming to our shores and this pandemic beginning to spread. But there was also an intense frustration that we had for many years worked on this program without being able to engender enough support for it that we could really accelerate it. We've raised an antibody against it. It's not a candidate antibody. But had we had the resources and remit 5 years ago, we could have had a therapeutic at the ready. And this focused our minds very intensely for a period of quite a few weeks about, okay, frustration is great if it's motivating. What can we do with this? And that's where this pandemic security initiative concept came from. We said, it's time to fix this broken system around infectious disease development. And, you know, I love the title of this podcast because it's not a huge change, right? It is truly an incremental change. The only thing that's missing, there's funding from our national science agencies that funds research in our academic labs. The best and brightest infectious disease scientists are doing research all the time. In the United States, the NIAID funds $6 billion a year in infectious disease and immune research, and that results in 2 patents every single day. And so the innovation is there. What's missing is that next step from innovation through to translation into drugs, into tests that can actually help patients. And the reason for that, of course, is that there's no market at the end of it. And so the idea is simply, let's create a different system. Let's say that as a people, we need to do this so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again in the future.
So I think, you know, truly fascinating. If I interpret, and I know you can't say with certainty, but it sounds like, I mean, we don't hear the term broad spectrum and antiviral in the same sentence terribly often. Right. I have to say, you know, my attention snaps to that. And whilst you don't know, I think you do know for SARS and MERS, because that's in the past and it's been measured, and it sounds like pretty likely. Essentially what I heard was we had a solution, but we just didn't develop it because there was no market.
We did our level best to bring it forward. But in our model, we're always looking for partners. We're always looking for funding. And we bring an innovative new oncology drug forward. There's a lot of people interested in partnering, a lot of people interested in
Right.
funding, because there's a return at the end of it. And to be fair to our entire industry, everyone has a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And you cannot fulfill that if you're developing something without a market. And so it was only really the fact that we were an entrepreneurial, agile, small organization that was financially stable that we were able to take that decision back 6 years ago.
But and to be clear, I'm not sort of apportioning any kind of blame or whatever. I'm just, you know, the resounding message is so fundamentally broken, but had we fixed it, we have the potential for a solution, not just for a single instance, but going forward, which is just, you know, and again, I talk about this, I've talked about it a lot in the last several months, you know, the refocusing and the acceleration of thinking as a result of this pandemic is, you know, one of the many silver linings, and, you know, many in silver linings with COVID-19, not typically in the same sentence. So that's fantastic. So how do we fix this? What is pandemic security, and how do we make sure we're not in this circumstance again?
Absolutely. So it starts with risk assessment. And so there is a list of pathogens. The WHO keeps one, BARDA keeps one, NIH and IAID, they all have their list of priority pathogens. And there is a very sophisticated set of risk factors that goes into each one. What is its natural reservoir? What is the likelihood of moving from its natural reservoir to humans? What is the expected contagiousness? What is the expected morbidity and mortality? There are even scales where they look at how much fear would be expected to be generated in the public and what those impacts would be of fear on the economics. And so these models are really well understood, and you can prioritize what the most likely, most impactful pathogens are. Once you know what those are, there's a process that we do every day. You go out into the world and say, professors, what are you working on? What are you working on in infectious disease? What are you working on in these particular pathogens? And by the way, because of the way the funding mechanisms are set up, most of these professors are incentivized to work on the highest priority pathogens, right? And so there's a lot of innovation out there. The challenge then is sorting through and kissing a lot of frogs and saying, okay, this is good, but this is good, but this is good. Wait, there's nothing wrong with this one. Let's work on this one and develop it until we have data that say it shouldn't continue. You know, it's a very negative way to see the world, but that's the part that's missing right now, is to take it from a high impact scientific publication through to an actual drug, to figure out what its PK is, to figure out whether there's toxicity we need to deal with, to figure out what the manufacturability is, how to formulate, how to administer, when to administer. These types of things are classic drug development challenges that go on all the time in other parts of our industry, but aren't really going on in infectious disease. And so that's what's missing, because we cannot find sufficient funding in order to bring these things forward. The Pandemic Security Initiative is envisioned as a public-private partnership where we, the people, say, this is an important activity. We don't want to be in COVID again. And so we're going to take relatively a very small amount of money, and we're going to prepare for these most likely to hit us pathogens. And what that means is funding goes in, we're able to develop dozens of these into the clinic, and then maybe a dozen through the other end. We can scale it up or down however we like. What we have then is a safety readout on therapeutics and vaccines. We have an efficacy readout, and we have the ability to stockpile them. And of course, we hope we never use them. I mean, this is another aspect where if we do preparedness well, it's absolutely silent. Nobody hears about it, because when there's a small cluster that maybe is about to become an outbreak, we have the tools in our toolbox to go and address it wherever it's happened. And it doesn't have to get beyond that and become pandemic. And so that's really the ultimate goal, is to make it so that it stays SARS-CoV-2 and it never gets a name like COVID, right? It never becomes a public discussion. That's what preparedness is. And that's one of the challenges in garnering public support in the absence of a pandemic, is that if it's done well, nobody knows about it.
For those of you just joining, I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and today I'm talking to Dr. Jake Reder. He's the CEO of CeldarMedical. We were just talking about pandemic security and the way in which we essentially change the sort of investment and focus strategy to develop things that hopefully people never ever see or hear about, which, is challenging when you think about some of the sort of focus and attention, and one of the phrases I've seen sort of bubbling up recently is COVID fatigue. People are, tired of hearing about it. How do we maintain that focus so that this doesn't become another activity that doesn't receive it? Because what we've learned clearly through your experiences is we have solutions, we just haven't executed on them. I mean, that's my sort of fast read to this.
That's correct. And so there's a lot wrapped up in that question. The sociological question of how do we get through the fatigue is beyond me. It's beyond me. I can tell you that the people with whom I interact, the scientists, the people doing the drug development, the entrepreneurs, there's no fatigue. There's none. There's excitement. There's focus. There's a gravity and seriousness to the situation. But the way that I think that group is able to avoid fatigue is that we are seeing these incremental steps towards a solution in this particular case. And when we're talking about the Pandemic Security Initiative, I and we are seeing the potential for truly a change the world opportunity here, so that we are fundamentally better off and fundamentally more secure than we were a year ago. And so for that, there's no fatigue there. There's excitement there. I completely understand. I have 3 young children who are not thrilled about wearing masks all the time, right? They're not thrilled about staying 6 feet away from their friends. I think we've done a reasonable job of educating them as to why it's important, but that why is an intellectual argument. It's not a gut level argument. And after a year of these extreme changes in our behavior, it does get tiring. Again, another reason that we should really be preparing so that we don't have to go through this again, so that this does not have to become the new norm.
So as you think about that, and, the security initiative, you think obviously about financial security. I mean, I think that's one of the challenges embedded here is that, the financial security for anybody that spends time, unless you're a pure researcher and that's your passion, you have to have, and, we talked about this earlier, the fiduciary responsibility needs to be in place. How are you helping solve that aspect so that you can bring more people in? This seems like the moment for it.
Yeah. So it's a great question, and it's a multivariate answer. So from CeldarMedical's perspective, we have a singular mission, and that is to improve human health. We're a privately held company. We're not traded on any stock exchange. We do not have any demand to provide additional return to our shareholders. We're also not stupid. If we can impact positively human health, we know that the financial stuff will follow. But we are singularly focused on improving human health. If we go a layer out from that within the pandemic security initiatives to some of our partners in the contract research organizations, the CROs, or the contract development and manufacturing organizations, CDMOs, they right now are doing no business in infectious disease development. This is an entirely new white space for them. And so for them, this is simply a new business opportunity. And so we go to them and we say, we need to run a trial, and we get some bids and we say, this is the most competitive thing we can do. And they'll have margin in that. And so for them, it is a step change in what their accessible market is. So nothing but positive there. And we've received nothing but support and excitement there. From the perspective of our pharmaceutical partners, there are, in every pharma company right now, there are regular debates about strategy and how strategy should be impacted by infectious disease as a sector. And so we're going to end up with a lot of different answers to that question. But I will say that the pharma industry, I think, has been often maligned regarding their really fundamental contributions to our society. And now that we're in this very difficult situation, I think the general public is starting to see that, hey, these guys are actually pretty helpful. They're the ones that are working 24/7 literally until we have a vaccine. And so that benefit there, I think, is writ large in the midst of a pandemic. And again, engaging in something that can help us to be prepared for the future is something that, again, unanimously, every large pharma I've spoken with, it doesn't move their financial needle, but it's the right thing to do, and they get that. And they're excited about participating, about providing access to proprietary platforms or expertise or that sort of thing. And so, and then the rest of the groups that are involved, like our elected representatives or representatives from the general public or NGOs, they don't have that fiduciary demand. And so they have their own and hopefully fairly obvious reasons for wanting to be prepared.
So we've got a little bit of time left. As you think about the future and the impact of this, tell us where this is going. What's the opportunity relative to, both our current crisis, but also going forward? Because I think, if this has taught us anything, we sure as hell don't want to have this another time round. What are you thinking about, and what are the steps to get us there?
Yeah. So the vision 5 years out would be to have that toolbox or that quiver with the tools, the tests, the innovative diagnostics that are anticipatory, that are designed for what is likely to arrive, to have vaccines and to have therapeutics. And the interplay between vaccines and therapeutics is complex, but you need both. And so to fill our toolbox such that we have a more likely than not chance of being ready when the next thing comes. The path from here to there is very well understood. The drug development process is extremely well studied. We know the probabilities of success. We know how many we need to put in the front end in order to get how many out the back end. We know how long it takes, how much it costs. All of that is well understood. It just needs to be done. And in order to be done, it needs to have an injection of funding. And I would argue that needs to come from we as a society rather than a set of artificial push or pull incentives that we've been trying for decades now and really have brought us to this point.
So in some respects, I see that as, maybe a pandemic investment on the part of society, right?
Absolutely.
We invest in other things. Why can't we invest in this as a sort of methodology with a clear set of paths? I like that toolbox concept of, fill it up. I mean, I believe in this so strongly, the right tool for the right job. And that's, for home maintenance, I'm just saying. But it's true in science, right?
Well, and you're a medical doctor. As a frontline responder, if you do not have the tools with which to help your patients, how horrible is that feeling? If all you've got is a ventilator, if you're lucky, how horrible is that feeling? If all you've got is some generic drugs that you're hoping their side effects will be beneficial in this context, how horrible is that for our first responders? And so we're working to get them the tools to fill that toolbox so that they can use all of their training and expertise to treat individual patients and to get this into the hands of the governments so that they can surround these outbreaks and snuff them out before they become pandemic.
Fantastic. As usual, we've run out of time. It just remains for me to thank you for both the work that you're doing. I think the foresight and the attempts at sort of resolving this issue for the longer term, not just for the short term challenges, and excited to see what the future brings. So, Jake, thanks for joining me today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Be safe, wear your mask, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks for joining me today. Do you have any better ideas, or have you found a small incremental change that's brought about a big improvement in your world? Let's continue the conversation on our hashtag, The Incrementalist, or share with me at DrNick1 on Twitter. You can find more information about the show on our program page at healthcarenowradio.com. And tune in next time to hear my discussions with leaders and innovators from around the globe who've revolutionized their space by using small incremental improvements to achieve their moonshot. I'm Dr. Nick, the Incrementalist, and I'm starting a revolution through evolution.